Hi, I'm Andrew, and what happened on our 10th wedding anniversary still haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be a night to celebrate us 10 years of marriage, 10 years of laughter, struggles, and building a life together. I'd made reservations at the same small Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date, even called ahead to ensure they had her favorite dessert ready. Everything was perfect, or at least I thought so. Emily, my wife, had been quieter than usual leading up to the big day. She claimed it was just work stress, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I brushed it aside, telling myself I was overthinking things. That evening, she came downstairs in a simple black dress, her hair styled, and her makeup flawless. She looked stunning, but there was something in her eyes. Distant, almost like she was preoccupied. "You look beautiful," I said, stepping toward her. She smiled faintly. "Thanks, Andrew." We left the house together, but as I drove us to the restaurant, her phone buzzed several times. She glanced at it quickly, frowning before tucking it back into her purse. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah, just some work stuff. Don't worry about it," she said, looking out the window. At the restaurant, things started out fine, at least on the surface. We ordered our usuals, shared a bottle of wine, and reminisced about that first date all those years ago. But there was a tension in the air, like she was counting down the minutes to leave. Then, midway through dessert, her phone buzzed again. This time, she excused herself to the restroom and took her purse with her. I sat there trying to shake the sinking feeling in my gut. She didn't come back. Minutes turned into 15, then 20. The waiter approached, asking if we wanted the check, and I mumbled something about my wife stepping out for a call. I finally stood and went to look for her, but the restroom was empty. She was gone. I stood frozen in the empty hallway of the restaurant, staring at the door to the women's restroom, as if expecting her to walk out at any moment. But she didn't. A thousand thoughts raced through my mind. Maybe she'd gotten a call and stepped outside. Maybe something had happened, an emergency. But then, why wouldn't she tell me? I walked briskly back to the table, hoping I'd find her sitting there waiting for me, her expression apologetic. Instead, I found only the half-empty wine glasses and the remains of our untouched dessert. "Excuse me," I said to the hostess, my voice tight. "Did you see my wife leave?" The young woman shook her head. "No, sir. I've been here the whole time. She didn't walk past me." I thanked her, though my heart was sinking fast. Grabbing my coat, I stepped outside into the chilly evening air and scanned the parking lot. My car was still there, exactly where I'd parked it. Her phone call couldn't have been long, if that was even what she was doing. I called her, once, then twice. The first call rang out, going to voicemail. The second was rejected after 2 rings. The sinking feeling turned into full-blown dread. Something wasn't right. I paced the sidewalk in front of the restaurant, clutching my phone and staring at the screen as though willing it to buzz with an explanation. Minutes stretched on, and the cold seeped into my bones, but still, nothing. Finally, I drove home, my mind racing with questions and scenarios I didn't want to entertain. When I arrived, the house was dark. No sign of Emily's car. I stepped inside, flicking on the lights and calling out for her. "Emily?" Silence. I walked through the house, checking every room, every corner. Her coat wasn't by the door, her purse wasn't on the counter. It was like she hadn't been there at all. I tried calling again, and this time, her voicemail message felt like a taunt. I left a shaky message, forcing calm into my voice. "Emily, it's me. Just call me back when you get this. I'm worried about you." Hours passed. Midnight came and went, and still no word. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open with her walking in, ready with some story about why she'd disappeared, but it stayed closed. When the clock struck 1 a.m., my phone finally buzzed. A message. "Sorry, Andrew. Got caught up with something. Be home soon." That was it. No explanation, no details, just a hollow apology that felt like a slap in the face. She didn't walk through the door until almost 2 in the morning. When I saw her, my relief was overshadowed by the growing knot in my stomach. She looked too calm, too collected for someone who had vanished for hours without explanation. Her dress was wrinkled, her makeup slightly smudged. She stepped inside and froze when she saw me sitting there, waiting. "Oh," she said, her voice light, like this was nothing. "You're still up. Where were you?" I asked, my voice even but laced with something colder. She hesitated for just a moment too long. "Work," she said quickly. "Something came up." "At midnight?" Her face flushed slightly, but she kept her composure. "It's a big project, Andrew. You know how it is." I didn't reply. I just watched her, waiting for more. But she didn't offer anything else. Instead, she brushed past me, heading toward the stairs. "I'm exhausted," she said over her shoulder. "We can talk in the morning." I sat there for a long time after she disappeared upstairs, replaying everything in my head. Her excuses, her tone, her calmness. It didn't add up. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I didn't know the woman I'd shared my life with. The next morning, Emily was already up and moving by the time I came downstairs. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. and I could hear the soft hum of the radio playing in the kitchen. For a fleeting moment, everything felt normal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. "Good morning," she said cheerfully as she poured coffee into a mug and slid it toward me. "I made your favorite." "Morning," I replied, taking the mug and leaning against the counter. I watched her closely as she moved around the kitchen, humming to herself. There was something too perfect about her demeanor, like she was trying too hard. I sipped the coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. "You sleep okay?" I asked casually. She nodded, her back to me as she stirred her own coffee. "Yeah, I did. You?" I hesitated for a moment. "Not really. I couldn't stop thinking about last night." Her hand paused briefly before resuming its motion, stirring the sugar into her cup. She turned to face me, her expression carefully composed. "Andrew, I already explained. It was work. Derek called, and it was urgent. I didn't want to ruin our evening by dragging you into it." "At 2 in the morning?" I pressed, my tone calm but firm. Her smile wavered slightly before returning, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It took longer than I thought. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to upset you." The apology felt hollow, rehearsed. I studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "All right," I said, stepping away from the counter. "I just needed to hear it from you." Her shoulders relaxed visibly, and she turned back to her coffee. I walked into the living room, leaving her in the kitchen. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking things. Emily acted normal, cheerful, attentive, but there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. Her phone was never out of her reach. It was always face down on the counter or tucked into her bag, and every time it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly, sometimes smiling faintly before putting it away. One evening, while I was reading on the couch, Emily was in the garage, organizing boxes she'd been meaning to sort through for months. Her phone sat on the dining table, plugged into the charger. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. It would be so easy to pick it up, just to glance at her messages. I told myself it was wrong, that I was being paranoid, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I walked over and picked it up. The screen lit up, showing a text notification. It was from Derek. "Great seeing you today. Let me know when you can sneak away again." My stomach churned. My hands trembled as I set the phone back on the table, its weight suddenly unbearable. Emily's voice called out from the garage, "Andrew, can you grab me some tape from the junk drawer?" I jumped, quickly stepping away from the table. "Yeah, one sec." I grabbed the tape and handed it to her. Avoiding her gaze, she didn't seem to notice my unease. Smiling as she thanked me and went back to sorting boxes. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the message in my head. It gnawed at me, refusing to let me sleep. Emily seemed oblivious, falling asleep almost immediately, her breathing soft and steady. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The message was clear enough to raise suspicions, but vague enough that I couldn't confront her without looking paranoid. If I wanted the truth, I needed to be smart. The next morning, I called Tom. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you have time for a drink tonight? I need some advice." That evening, I met Tom at a quiet bar we'd frequented in our younger days. It was the kind of place where the music was low, and the dim lighting made every corner feel like its own private space. Tom was already at a booth when I arrived, a beer in front of him and his phone face down on the table. "You look like hell," he said, motioning for me to sit. "Thanks," I muttered, sliding into the seat across from him. He waved over the server and ordered me a drink without asking. It was a small gesture, but it reminded me why I'd called him. Tom had always been steady, level-headed when I wasn't, the guy who'd tell you the truth even when it hurt. "So, what's going on?" he asked once the server left. "You sounded off on the phone." I hesitated, unsure of where to start. Finally, I took a deep breath and told him everything: the late nights, the guarded phone, the message from Derek. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back and let out a low whistle. "That's rough, man." "Yeah," I said, rubbing the back of my neck. I don't know what to do. I don't want to accuse her without proof, but I can't keep sitting here pretending nothing's wrong." Tom nodded slowly. "Look, you know I've got your back, but if your gut's telling you something, there's probably a reason. What do you know about this Derek guy?" "Not much," I admitted. "He's her boss. I met him once at a company party. Seemed slick, I guess. Like he knew he was the smartest guy in the room." Tom's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've heard about him. Derek Caldwell, right? He's got a reputation." My stomach tightened. "What kind of reputation?" Tom glanced around as if checking to make sure no one could overhear us. "The kind that gets whispered about. Affairs with employees, shady deals. Nothing concrete, but enough rumors that people talk. He's been divorced twice, both times under messy circumstances." I leaned back in my seat, the weight of his words settling on me. "I'm not saying Madison's involved in anything," Tom added quickly. "But if she is, you need to be smart about how you handle it." "Smart how?" I asked, leaning forward. Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, and a mischievous smirk tugged at his lips. "Ever heard of Spy Shop? It's this little place downtown. They sell, let's call it surveillance equipment." I frowned. "Like what?" GPS trackers, hidden cameras, phone monitoring software, you name it, he said. You're not just going to sit around waiting for answers, right? The idea unsettled me, but it also made sense. If I wanted the truth, I had to be proactive. The next day, I found myself standing outside a small, unassuming shop tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The sign above the door simply read, Security Solutions. Inside, the shelves were lined with everything from nanny cams to sophisticated audio recorders. A bored-looking clerk greeted me with a nod. Need something specific? He asked. Yeah, I said, clearing my throat. I'm looking for something discreet. Cameras, maybe a GPS tracker. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Instead, he led me to a display case filled with devices that wouldn't look out of place in a spy movie. Cameras hidden in smoke detectors, recorders small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, and GPS trackers no bigger than a pack of gum. I chose a few items, making sure I understood how each one worked before paying in cash and leaving. That evening, I waited until Emily was out of the house. Another yoga session, or so she claimed. I used the time to install the devices. A tiny camera went inside the decorative vase in the living room, positioned to capture the main seating area. Another camera, disguised as a USB charger, was plugged into the wall in the bedroom. The GPS tracker was the trickiest. I attached it to the underside of her car, double-checking that it was secure and functional before stepping back and wiping my hands on my jeans. By the time she came home, everything was in place. How was yoga? I asked casually as she set her mat down by the door. Good, she said, her smile a little too bright. You? Just caught up on some work, I replied, matching her tone. As we went through the motions of the evening, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't entirely in the dark. Now, all I had to do was wait. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope. On the surface, things between Emily and me were normal, almost disturbingly so. She'd make small talk over breakfast, ask about my day, and even suggest a movie night, as though nothing had changed. But I couldn't unsee the message from Derek or shake the growing suspicion that I was living with a stranger. The GPS tracker became my silent ally. Every time Emily left the house, I'd check my phone, watching as the blinking dot moved across the map. Most of her destinations were harmless. Her office, the grocery store, the yoga studio, but the patterns started to stand out. For one, she rarely stayed late at work anymore, despite her frequent claims of long hours. Instead, her car would sit idle at random parking lots or side streets for an hour, sometimes two. It was subtle enough that she might think I wouldn't notice, but I did. One evening, she told me she was meeting Jenna for drinks. As soon as she left, I checked the tracker. She drove past the restaurant where she and Jenna usually went, heading instead to a part of town I didn't recognize. The dot stopped at a small coffee shop. Curious, I opened my laptop and switched to the camera feeds at home. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs that anyone else had been there while I was at work. Still, I felt restless, like I was missing a piece of the puzzle. That night, I sat on the couch, my laptop open as I browsed forums about catching infidelity. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd be doing, but I needed answers. Strategies, tools, and anything to confirm or disprove my suspicions. One thread caught my attention. It was filled with advice from people who'd been in similar situations, detailing how they'd caught their partners. Some of it was technical, how to install software on phones or track financial records. Other advice was more psychological. Pay attention to their body language, their routines. People can't hide everything forever. The next morning, I called Tom again. You're really going through with this? He asked when I explained what I'd been reading. What choice do I have? I said, pacing my office. I can't accuse her without proof. And I can't keep living like this, pretending everything's fine. Tom sighed. All right, but if you're doing this, you need to be smart about it. Take your time, don't tip her off. I'm way ahead of you, I said. The following weekend, I put one of the forum tips into action. Emily had mentioned running errands, her usual Saturday routine, so I stayed home and combed through our shared finances. Most of it was straightforward, but a few charges stood out. Hotel receipts, marked as conference expenses, and unexplained purchases from boutique stores I'd never heard of. The pieces were starting to come together, but I needed more. That evening, Emily returned home carrying a shopping bag. She seemed in high spirits, humming softly as she unpacked groceries and placed the bag on the counter. What's that? I asked, gesturing to it. Oh, just a dress I saw on sale, she said quickly, brushing past me to hang it in the closet. It wasn't like her to make impulsive purchases. She usually fretted over every dollar we spent, so why the sudden splurge? I decided to test her. Maybe we should go out next weekend, I said casually. That way you can wear your new dress. Her reaction was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of hesitation before she smiled. Sure, that sounds nice. I nodded, forcing a smile of my own. But deep down, I knew. Over the next few days, I kept my distance emotionally, focusing instead on gathering as much information as possible. I upgraded the camera setup at home, adjusting the angles to cover blind spots. I even added a new microphone near the entryway just in case. Emily didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't say anything. She carried on with her routine, slipping out for yoga or work dinners, always returning with a faint air of detachment. I told myself to be patient, that the truth would reveal itself in time. And then, one night, the tracker showed her car parked in a place it had never been before, a location that would lead me closer to the answers I desperately needed. The location on the GPS tracker was odd, a quiet cafe tucked away in a residential area far from Emily's usual routine. Her car had been parked there for over an hour. It wasn't the kind of place she and I had ever visited, nor did it seem like somewhere she'd go with Jenna. I needed to know what she was doing there. I grabbed my jacket, telling myself this was just reconnaissance. I wasn't planning to confront her, not yet. If this was innocent, I didn't want to blow it out of proportion, but if it wasn't, I'd be prepared. The cafe was small, with large windows that spilled warm light onto the quiet street. I parked a block away and walked, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. From across the street, I could see Emily sitting at a table near the window. She wasn't alone. The man across from her was Derek. I froze, my stomach nodding as I watched them. They weren't touching, but their body language spoke volumes. She was leaning in, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. He reached across the table, brushing her hand briefly before pulling back. I ducked behind a parked car, my mind racing. This was it, proof. But it wasn't enough to confront her. I needed undeniable evidence, something she couldn't dismiss as a misunderstanding or explain away. That night, I stayed up late, combing through surveillance options. If Emily and Derek were meeting outside of work, it wouldn't just be a one-time thing. I needed to capture their interactions somewhere neutral, somewhere they'd feel safe letting their guard down. The next day, I found the perfect solution, a discreet camera designed for temporary setups. It could be placed in cars, small rooms, or even outdoor spots. It was motion-activated, capable of recording hours of footage, and could be remotely accessed through my phone. I purchased it online, expedited the shipping, and waited. A week later, the camera arrived. Emily mentioned she'd be heading out for yoga again that evening, her go-to excuse lately. I knew better than to believe her. While she was getting ready, I quietly left the house, heading to the cafe I'd seen her at before. I parked nearby and set up the camera inside a planter near the window, its lens angled perfectly to capture the corner table where they'd sat last time. Satisfied, I drove away and parked a few blocks down, opening the live feed on my phone. It wasn't long before her car appeared, pulling into the same spot it had before. Derek arrived shortly after. Later that night, I reviewed the footage in my car, my hands shaking as I played back their interaction. It was clear this wasn't a business meeting or a casual catch-up. The way they looked at each other, the subtle touches, it was intimate. This was what I needed. But instead of confronting her that night, I waited. I wanted more. The next evening, the tracker led me to a different location, a hotel near downtown. I parked nearby, setting up the camera again in a discreet spot facing the entrance. I didn't have to wait long. Emily arrived first, stepping out of her car in a sleek black dress. She glanced around briefly before walking inside. Minutes later, Derek pulled up, entering through the same door. I clenched my jaw, the weight of their betrayal settling over me like a storm cloud. But instead of anger, I felt a cold determination. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the minutes ticked by. The hotel loomed ahead, its glowing sign casting an almost mocking glow over the scene. Emily and Derek had been inside for over an hour, and the camera was doing its job, capturing every second. I opened the live feed on my phone. The camera was perfectly positioned, showing the main entrance and the hallway leading to the elevators. I fast-forwarded through the earlier footage, watching them arrive separately and head toward the elevator bank. They didn't look nervous. If anything, they seemed comfortable, even routine in their behavior. It made my blood boil. But this wasn't the time to act impulsively. I needed to stay calm, collected, let them dig their own graves a little deeper. The next morning, I reviewed the footage in detail. Derek and Emily didn't leave the hotel until well past midnight, exiting separately but only a few minutes apart. I saved the recordings, knowing they would be the centerpiece of the case I was building. I spent the next few days preparing. My lawyer was already on board, having reviewed the earlier evidence I'd collected. But now I had the missing piece, irrefutable proof of their affair. The final part of my plan was to ensure they couldn't escape the consequences. A week later, I got my chance. Emily told me she had another work dinner and would be home late. I nodded, playing my part as the oblivious husband, and wished her a good evening. As soon as she left, I followed her. The tracker led me to a new location this time, another boutique hotel, even more discreet than the last. I parked down the street and activated the camera I'd brought with me, positioning it to capture both the entrance and the surrounding parking lot. I didn't wait long. Emily's car pulled in first, followed by Derek's a few minutes later. They greeted each other briefly before heading inside, their movements easy and unhurried. By midnight, I had all the evidence I needed. I returned home, carefully packing the recordings into a secure folder on my laptop. But instead of confronting Emily directly, I reached out to Derek's wife, Angela. We'd spoken briefly before, when I'd first found out about the affair. She'd been skeptical at first, but once I sent her the earlier screenshots and footage, her tone changed completely. Now, I had something even more damning to share. The following evening, I sat in my living room, waiting. Emily arrived home just after 10 p.m., her steps light as she walked through the door. "You're up late," she said, setting her bag on the counter. "I wanted to talk," I said evenly. She hesitated, her smile faltering. "About what?" "About Derek and the hotel," I said, leaning forward. Her face went pale. "Andrew, Don't bother," I interrupted, holding up my phone. I played a short clip of the footage from the previous night, the two of them walking into the hotel together. She froze, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words. "I've been watching you for weeks, Emily," I said coldly. "Every lie, every excuse, it's all here. You thought I wouldn't notice, but you underestimated me." Tears filled her eyes. "Andrew, please." "No," I snapped. "You don't get to plead innocence. I gave you every chance to come clean and you chose to keep lying. Now you can deal with the consequences." The fallout was swift and brutal. My lawyer filed for divorce the next morning, using the evidence I'd gathered to ensure I came out ahead financially. Angela, true to her word, went after Derek with a vengeance. She shared the footage with his company, exposing his misconduct. By the end of the week, he was out of a job, his reputation in shreds. As for Emily, she tried to reach out to me, leaving tearful voicemails and long messages begging for forgiveness. I deleted every one of them without listening. In the end, I walked away from the marriage with my head held high. It wasn't easy, it never is, but I knew I'd done the right thing. Emily and Derek had made their choices, and now they were paying the price. For the first time in years, I felt free.